In this video, we're going to cover the basics of nonprofit organizations. But first, let's talk about how this ties into that bigger picture of nonprofits. I broke this textbook out into sections about all of the different stakeholder groups that nonprofits serve, and that's a topic that we're going to introduce in this particular video. In this section, part 1, we're going to talk about nonprofits in general, with 3 sections. And in this first section, part 1, we're going to talk about nonprofits in general, with it broken down into 3 sections. The nonprofit basics, which we cover in this video, mission, strategic planning, and measuring strategic effectiveness, and finally, ethics. So let's dive into those basics of nonprofits, which is the foundation of this entire course. At the conclusion of this lesson, you'll understand the following learning outcomes. First, we're going to actually define nonprofits. There are so many misconceptions out there about nonprofits, but I want to clarify for you exactly what they are and what they aren't. I'm also going to talk about how they impact the economy and are a much bigger player in the business game than a lot of people give them credit for. We'll also discuss the distinctions between nonprofit and for-profit businesses because it might surprise you that these 2 different business types are actually more similar than they are different. I'll also make some distinctions between the different types of nonprofit organizations, like direct service agencies and advocacy organizations, and describe 4 general types of nonprofit organizations. I'll also explain how you'll be able to identify at the end of this video those key stakeholder groups and understand how nonprofits can be drivers for innovation and how nonprofit mission can impact their innovativeness. And finally, we'll characterize those traits of high-impact, high-performing nonprofit organizations. But first, let's dive into the first learning outcome, which is defining nonprofits and understanding how they positively impact the economy. Now, when we talk about nonprofits, you're going to hear it referred to in a lot of different ways. Some people call it nonprofits with non and profit put together. Some people hyphenate the words. Some people call them NFPs or not-for-profit organizations, or NGOs for non-governmental organizations, or charities, which you'll learn in a minute is actually just outright wrong. But for purposes of this class and in the textbook, for consistency's sake, I'm going to call it nonprofits. All one word, no hyphenation. And when we talk about nonprofits, we're talking about organizations that exist to advance a social cause for public benefit. Further, they're not independently owned and they do not generate a profit for owners or investors. In general terms, they're pretty much like for-profit companies. The difference is where the profit goes. It's kind of a misnomer to call them nonprofits, because I can tell you from experience, when you run a nonprofit, you're very much trying to earn a profit. Your objective is to bring in more money than you spend. You absolutely want and need a net profit at the end of the day. It's how you keep the lights on. But the difference, that big distinction between nonprofit and for-profit, is where the profit goes. Nonprofits do not have investors, they don't have owners, they don't have shareholders. They only exist to serve the greater public good or to serve a specific stakeholder group. And the profit goes to serve that group and fulfill the mission of the organization. Now, sometimes people mistakenly refer to nonprofits as charities. Like nonprofits and charities are interchangeable terms, but they're not. They are different, distinct terms with different definitions. A nonprofit is what I just defined, and that is different than a charity. A charity certainly can be a nonprofit. In fact, it's a type of nonprofit. A charity is a type of nonprofit that engages in activities specifically for the purpose of assisting people in need. Now, it's important to understand that not all nonprofits are charities. There are a ton of different examples of nonprofits that we'll talk about in this video that exist that are not charities. But we'll get to that in a minute. But as one quick little example, if you live in a suburban neighborhood, you might have a homeowners association that makes sure that neighbors aren't loud, they keep their houses nice and tidy, that their yards are not unkempt. And that, an HOA, is usually an example of a nonprofit organization. They're usually structured that way. But is an HOA really helping people in need? Is that a charity? No, they're not. They have a good mission, they have a good purpose, unless you're the anti-HOA crowd, but they're there and they exist to help people in a certain and specific way. But they're not a charity. So that's one big misconception about nonprofits, that they're all charities. They're not. So in this class, you won't hear me refer to charities specifically as a monolith. We're going to talk about nonprofits. Let's talk about another misconception about nonprofits, and that is that they're really a non-factor in our economy. That actually couldn't be further from reality, though. In the United States alone, there are nearly 1.8 million nonprofit organizations, and they're a huge employer with over 12 million employees in the United States alone. So that's a pretty decent chunk of the workforce as an industry. And when it comes to the impact on global gross domestic product, nonprofits account for about 4.5% of the GDP in the countries that are studied. Now that you know what nonprofits are, you know that not all nonprofits are charities. Let's dive into that second learning outcome, which is to look at those distinctions between nonprofit and for-profit organizations. Because unless you're pretty heavily involved in a nonprofit, either working for one as an employee, being on a board, you probably hold some of these misconceptions too, and that's okay. I'm here to dispel those misconceptions. One of the biggest misconceptions is that nonprofits are this totally different animal than for-profit organizations, that they operate differently. They're this kind of weird entity that is just so vastly different than for-profits. When in fact, nonprofits are more similar to for-profit companies than they are different. I can tell you from experience because I ran a nonprofit for over a decade at the highest level as executive director or kind of the CEO position. And I can promise you that every single thing that I did in running that nonprofit is exactly the same stuff that any for-profit CEO is doing on a day-to-day basis. You're still accountable for running a business. You're still accountable for minimizing the amount of money you spend to maximize the amount of money that you bring in. The distinction here is that nonprofits serve the greater good, or they serve a certain community. Nonprofits don't have stockholders or investors or shareholders. They serve the greater good. But nonprofits are still trying to drive a profit. They're trying to bring in as much money as possible and spend as little as possible. The distinction is where that money goes. Instead of enriching individual human beings like an owner or stockholders or investors, nonprofits use their profit to serve their mission, which is usually to enrich the world, the community, some sort of greater good. It's not about enriching individuals. Nonprofits are also not individually owned. In fact, nonprofits are not owned by anyone other than pretty much the community. No one person owns a nonprofit. When I ran that nonprofit for over 10 years, I was not the owner. I had no ownership stake in it. I didn't own any stock. You don't own stock in nonprofits. I was responsible for leading it in partnership with my board of directors, which we'll cover in a future chapter. At the end of the day, nonprofits share a lot of similarities with for-profit organizations. They have to be effectively managed. You have to have great organizational design. You have to make smart business decisions. You have to be great leaders of people. You have to be on point with your financial operations. You have to have a marketing strategy because you're still selling a product. Yeah, it's not some tangible product or service or B2B or B2C service, but you are selling a product. You're selling hope. You're selling the cause. You're selling the mission. And that, my friends, at the end of the day, that is still a product, and you have to market that product. Another misconception that people have about nonprofits is that they don't have paid staff. And I hate this because then I see oftentimes college students who never consider nonprofits as a viable career path because they think that they're then destined for a life of poverty or that they're never going to earn a living. And that's just actually not the case. Now, in some cases, this is true. There are some really small nonprofit agencies or start-up nonprofit agencies that are run by just big-hearted volunteers who see a need, they want to fulfill that need, they're passionate about the mission, and they do that work for free. However, most even smaller, mid, or large size, sophisticated nonprofits, they do have paid staff, generally a large paid staff in some cases. And as we'll discuss in a future video, working at a nonprofit does not mean that you're destined to a life of poverty. It can be a viable career path. But nonprofits, they're not just run by volunteers. Volunteers are definitely part of the equation of what it takes to run a nonprofit organization. And for-profit companies can't get away with that. They can't have unpaid labor. That would be a labor law violation. But nonprofits generally make use of that unpaid volunteer labor in addition to paid staff positions. So the majority of nonprofit organizations, you're going to find a mix of unpaid volunteer labor and paid staff positions. And that's important because while volunteers are great, nonprofits usually are heavily dependent on volunteers to survive. Volunteers can kind of come and go as they please. They don't have that skin in the game like paid staff do. If you work for a nonprofit as a paid staff member, you have a really bad day, you might want to just throw your hands up and leave. You can't do that. You have bills to pay, you don't have another job lined up, so you're more likely to stay. So it is important for the success and future of most nonprofits that they have that nice, healthy mix of volunteers and staff. Another misconception that's not true and that drives me crazy is that working for a nonprofit is easy work, or that it's not real legitimate business work and it doesn't require the same skill set, the same business acumen, and that could not be further from the truth. In fact, I would make a good argument that running a nonprofit organization is much more difficult than running a for-profit organization, because not only do you need that literal same exact set of business skills, but you have to deal with the volunteer factor. And that's difficult. When you're running a nonprofit, you sometimes have hundreds or even thousands of individuals who are not paid. A lot of these people are donors. A lot of these people are big donors. They feel like that you owe them something and that you're beholden to them. And that can create a whole complex new set of issues, power struggles, and factors that for-profit leaders just don't have to deal with. Now, to highlight for you visually some of these key distinctions between nonprofit and for-profit organizations, I put together this handy dandy figure. As you can see, there are nonprofit organizations which have no ownership. Again, nobody owns a nonprofit. Whereas with a for-profit organization, those are owned by the owners or founders, or if it becomes a publicly traded company, they're owned by shareholders. Another big distinction is the purpose. As I mentioned previously, nonprofit organizations exist for public or mutual benefit. For-profit organizations, on the other hand, their purpose is to drive a profit, but that profit is for people, it's for their owners. Another big distinction is the tax treatment. Nonprofit organizations, in most cases, but not all, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are tax exempt, and that's a big distinction. Because of course, for-profit companies, obviously, they're subject to paying taxes. The workforce of nonprofit organizations is comprised of paid staff and volunteers, whereas a for-profit organization is just paid staff. Where money comes from also differs between nonprofit and for-profit organizations. With nonprofits, revenue is going to come from obviously contributions and donations, membership dues, grants, government funding, those types of things. With a for-profit organization, revenue is going to come primarily from selling the product, but also other things like investment income. When it comes to oversight, both organizations, in most cases, are overseen ultimately by a board of directors. A big distinction here, however, is that most board members on for-profit organization boards are paid positions. In a nonprofit, these are going to be unpaid positions. But the role and scope of what these boards do between nonprofit and for-profit is generally the same. Now, I do want to touch briefly a little bit more on that tax exemption thing. Now, I don't want to get too in the weeds here because this gets really detailed and fine-tuned. And if you're into finance or accounting, this is something that might excite you. And there's a whole sector of nonprofit accounting that specifically deals with IRS classifications, finance, and accounting issues for nonprofits. But for purposes of this class, I want you to understand just a few important key things. One is that nonprofits are actually corporations. They're just classified as nonprofit corporations. So when it comes to the IRS code and tax treatment, most nonprofits have their own special designation. Now, there are a lot of different IRS classifications, and it can get really confusing. But I want you to just focus on this. What you see here in figure 1-2 is a sampling of IRS classifications of the most common 501c nonprofit tax categories. There are 29 in total, but these are the most common. How a nonprofit is fitting within a certain category, it depends upon their mission and the type of purpose of the organization and who it serves. So as I mentioned before, not all nonprofits are charities, but all charities are nonprofits. So charitable agencies or charities is one of those larger classifications of nonprofits, since a lot of nonprofits are charitable in nature. So you will find that the most common IRS classification for nonprofits is specifically a 501c3 designation. That 3 is the designation for charitable organizations, but also religious and educational organizations. So if you're a student at a public university, like the University of Cincinnati, that is a public educational institution, so it would be classified as a 501c3 organization. So by and large, most nonprofits fit into that category of 501c3, but there are many others, 28 to be exact, that are different 501c something else designations. Now, not all nonprofits, but the vast majority of them are tax exempt. So what I want you to do is take a moment and I want you to pause and I want you to think about a nonprofit organization, just the first one that comes to your mind. It can be any nonprofit organization. It could be something that you volunteered for in the past, an organization where you're involved as a student, or just a nonprofit that comes to mind. And I want you to take a moment and I want you to search and I want you to see what type of classification they are. Chances are good it's probably a 501c3. May or may not be, depending upon the category. And to look at specific numbers, if you take all of the nonprofit organizations and you break them down into those classification and those categories, the vast majority of them, specifically 72% of nonprofits, are classified as a 501c3 organization. That means they're charitable, religious, or educational, and they are tax exempt. Now, again, there are 28 other 501c nonprofit areas and categories, but those represent the minority. The lion's share of 501c nonprofit organizations are classified as 501c3s. Again, it's 72%. Now, if we actually drill down and look specifically at 501c3 organizations, again, out of all nonprofits, 72% of them are 501c3s. So let's look specifically at 501c3 organizations. If you look at those, the overwhelming majority of 501c3s are categorized as public charities. Specifically, 91% of 501c3s are public charities. That other sliver of the pie, that other 9%, are private foundations. So if that wasn't confusing enough, because of course, the IRS can't make anything easy, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about different categories and classifications of nonprofit agencies that are not related to taxes. So you know what the 501c category is. 501c3 is the biggest. 72% of nonprofits are 501c3s. You also now know that of the 501c3 category specifically, the vast majority of those are public charities, with a small 9% representing private foundations. But now I want you to think about nonprofits across two key dimensions. And these are direct service agencies and advocacy organizations. So for purposes of putting all nonprofits into two general buckets, you've got two types, or again, two dimensions. You've got direct service agencies and you have advocacy organizations. So let's talk about what these are. Direct service agencies are those nonprofit organizations that provide direct services, or specifically programs in their communities. So they're working directly with the stakeholders or beneficiaries that they're intending to serve. So they're delivering programs directly. Now, in Learning Outcome 1, I give you an example of a homeowners association. As we know, that's not a charity, but they're still serving their stakeholder group. In this case, they're homeowners of a certain community. So they're providing direct services to that constituent base. Now, homeowner associations, they're probably not going to be involved in government advocacy or legislation at all, but a lot of other direct service agencies do get involved in advocacy work, but it's not their primary scope. For example, the American Heart Association is involved in advancing legislation that improves heart health for Americans because that's tied in with their mission. Now, it's not the key thing they do. They primarily focus on other things driven around heart healthy mission, but that is something that they kind of dabble in. That's why they're a direct service agency versus an advocacy organization. Advocacy organizations are different because instead of directly providing services to the community or to their stakeholder groups, their primary purpose of even existing is legislative in nature. Their purpose is to raise public awareness and or push for systemic change and or policy reform. But they're not out in the community serving soup or building houses or serving stakeholders directly. They're not out doing those charitable things. They're not serving a constituent base. They're not serving the community. Instead, they're out there specifically for the purpose of engaging in government relations as part of a broader advocacy campaign. Now that you know that there are two dimensions of nonprofits, you've got those direct service agencies and advocacy organizations, let's talk about how we can generally place all of these nonprofit organizations into one of four categories. Now, of these four types of nonprofit organizations, I first want to talk about the two categories that are generally tax-exempt 501c3 organizations, and those are the private foundations and the public charities. And remember, of the 501c3 classification, the vast majority of them are public charities. Only about 9% are private foundations. But those are two of our four categories. And then you have another category, which we've yet to kind of specifically address, which are the non-charitable nonprofits. And then you have those political organizations, which are advocacy organizations. And those two are not 501c3 organizations and may or may not benefit from tax exemption. So for the next learning outcome, let's dive deeper into those four categories of nonprofit organizations. First, let's talk about private foundations. As you can see from figure 1.4, Private foundations are direct service agencies because they're directly providing services, and they are generally categorized as 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. Private foundations are foundations that are established exclusively for charitable purposes. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how is that different than a public charity? Isn't that kind of the same thing? Well, they are similar in many ways, but a distinction between private foundations and public charities is that private foundations usually derive their financial support from just one person, one family, or a corporation. So a lot of times you'll find a very wealthy individual who has a lot of money, they're charitable in nature, maybe need some tax benefit, and they'll create a private foundation for charitable purposes. Now, sometimes it will be a family, like the Walton family who owns Walmart, or even a private foundation owned by a corporation, like the Scripps Company. They run the Scripps Foundation. And if you're already not confused enough, because this stuff is admittedly confusing, I want you to know that just because sometimes a nonprofit has the word foundation in its name and that's part of its brand, that does not necessarily mean it's actually a private foundation. A notable example is the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It's probably one of the most well-known foundations out there, but it's not actually classified as a private foundation. Clear as mud, right? Make-A-Wish is a public charity. They're actually deriving their revenue and their sources of income from the public, not from any one private individual, family, or corporation. Next are public charities. Public charities are also known as charitable nonprofits. And again, these are direct service agencies. So these are organizations directly providing service to the people that they serve in accordance to their mission. These are typically classified as those 501c3 IRS tax designation, which means that they're tax exempt. But if you are a 501c3, you do face certain kind of strict IRS restrictions. If you're a 501c3 and you're getting tax exemption as a benefit, you can't just run out there willy-nilly running your business as you wish. There are some pretty tight restrictions with which you have to comply. Things like donor acknowledgements, tax letters, all sorts of things. If you don't follow the IRS regulations, you risk losing that IRS designation and losing that benefit of tax exemption. Now, in this category of public charities, there is another type of nonprofit that fits in here, and that's public foundations. And you're probably now really scratching your head thinking, didn't we just talk about foundations in terms of it being its own category of private foundations? The difference here is private versus public. Because remember, with private foundations, they derive their financial support from just one person, a family, or corporation, whereas public foundations raise funds from the public. So public foundations are considered public charities. Now let's move on to a third type of nonprofit category, the non-charitable nonprofit. Now that's a real head scratcher, right? A non-charitable nonprofit? But remember, as we've discussed earlier, not all nonprofits are charities. Non-charitable nonprofits provide direct services. They're still existing not-for-profit. They're still serving stakeholders. They still have a mission, but it's not a profit for personal or individual gain or for stockholders. Instead, the stakeholders benefit. Now, it's not charitable in nature. You're not feeding the hungry or dealing with homelessness. These are services that aren't necessarily charitable in nature. These are things, again, like your homeowners associations, your membership organizations. I'll give you some specific examples here in a moment. And these are not 501c3s, but they're 501 something else. Remember, IRS has 29 501c categories. 501c3s are your public charities, your private foundations. Everything else gets one of those other 501c designations. And what that number is, whether it's 501c5, 501c9, whatever it is going to depend on the type of services that they provide. Remember, these are organizations that are still providing direct services, but they're not charitable in nature. And I want to give you some specific categories of these non-charitable nonprofits. First are social welfare organizations or specific associations. So these are nonprofit organizations. They're not existing for charity, but instead they focus on a common need or common welfare of a specific community. For example, AARP is the American Associations of Retired People. So they exist to serve the interests of a specific group, in this case, being people who are retired. Another category of non-charitable nonprofits are trade associations. These are nonprofit organizations, but they're not charitable. In this case, they represent the interests of businesses, professional groups, or sometimes even entire industries. So you might have something like a home builders association or HBA, or the AMA, which is the American Medical Association, and there are hundreds of other examples. So they serve a professional group, an industry, or the interests of a business, but they don't run for profit in the traditional way. They are nonprofit organizations, but they're non-charitable. And finally, there are social and recreational clubs. These are organizations that operate for the benefit of a specific membership group, and they must be primarily supported by that membership group. And they usually raise money through their membership, like things like required member dues and pressure for donations of members. So if you've ever been a part of a fraternity or a sorority or a fraternal organization like the Elks Club, that is very likely considered a social and recreational club, which is a type of non-charitable nonprofit. Now let's talk about that fourth category of nonprofits, and this is kind of an odd one. It stands out from the other three. And these are political nonprofits. Because political nonprofits exist specifically for political reasons, they are considered an advocacy organization. They're not a direct service agency because they're not out there providing direct services. Instead, their primary purpose is to influence legislation. Examples of political organizations are the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, or the NRA, the National Rifle Association, MoveOn.org, which serves to advocate for certain political candidates, and there are lots of other examples. These political organizations are typically classified as 501c4s. These are generally not tax exempt. This is important. 501c4 political organizations are not tax exempt because they engage in political campaign activity. And the IRS is very, very strict about this. In a future lesson, we'll talk more about advocacy organizations and the types of political activity that tax-exempt 501c3s can engage in, but know that 501c4 organizations are not tax-exempt. Now, what they do, however, in many cases, is kind of a little workaround to that IRS code. And they still want to raise money, they still want to support their cause, they still want to get that tax exemption benefit. So a lot of times 501c4 organizations will actually establish a separate foundation, a separate arm that exists outside of their primary political organization, which is a 501c4, and they'll create a 501c3 and fundraise and stay in compliance with IRS regulations through that organization as a roundabout way to still get tax exemption. Now let's take a look at some of the most influential nonprofit organizations. It's not surprising, given that we know the majority of nonprofit organizations, 72% of them, are classified as 501c3s, that 9 out of the 10 organizations that you see on this top 10 most influential nonprofit list are 501c3. And specifically, these are 501c3 public charities. Of these top 10 most influential nonprofits, only one of them, the HRC, which is the Human Rights Campaign, is classified as something different. HRC is classified as a 501c4 because they are a political organization. They do advocacy work. They seek to influence legislation for LGBTQ+ communities, but they do, as I mentioned, have a separate offshoot organization, the HRC Foundation, that is a 501c3. And that gets tax exemption, that stays in compliance with all the rules the IRS has about 501c3 organizations, and it allows them to raise money to still advance their cause, but not directly engage in legislative activity. Another thing that's important to note about nonprofits is that sometimes you have nonprofits that decide to structure as affiliate organizations. And these can sometimes be called affiliates, branches, or chapters. And this happens when you have a large organization that's either national or international, but they want or need to have a local grassroots presence in different markets. So what they'll do is they'll have their large global organization, they'll establish branches, chapters, or affiliates that exist as separate legal entities in these specific geographic communities, but they're still connected with that larger umbrella nonprofit organization. Now I'll give you an example. What you see here is a picture of a couple of folks with the cancer support community. I'm a board member. Here's our executive director with a fellow board member at a fundraising event. Cancer Support Community is a US-based organization that has a strong grassroots presence in individual local communities. It's a 501c3 charitable organization. Now, because they have a need to serve dozens of different local markets, they have an affiliate network. So I'm on the board for the Northern Kentucky Greater Cincinnati affiliate organization of the Cancer Support Community. So in our affiliate, we operate semi-independently. Cancer Support Community, as a larger umbrella organization, has consistent branding, marketing, programs, services, mission, that's the big one, the same brand. They might share services like payroll or accounting services, And of course, that big thing we have in common, I can't say it enough, is the mission. So every cancer support community affiliate across the country has all those same things in common, but they do have some autonomy. They usually operate a little differently in terms of governance. They have different geographic locations, things like that. So using an affiliate model is a really great way for nonprofits to expand and to have a bigger global presence, but to still feel like they're having a significant impact at that grassroots level, while still benefiting from the perks of being part of a larger umbrella organization. And there are tons of other examples of affiliate organizations. If you think of pretty much any large international nonprofit, they probably have an affiliate network. This is things like the American Diabetes Association, Make-A-Wish, LLS, March of Dimes. There are dozens of others. Now let's take a look at the different stakeholder groups that nonprofits serve. Now, when I designed this course and my textbook that goes with it, I wanted to really look at it from a stakeholder perspective. That's why the book has the word stakeholder in it. Because when you're running a business, the key to success is juggling the needs of different stakeholder groups. So when you look at nonprofits, there are a lot of different stakeholders, and we're going to break it down into 4 central stakeholder groups. And that's going to be the foundation for the textbook and for this entire class. But before we get into what those 4 categories are, I want to first talk about what stakeholders are. Stakeholders are anyone who has skin in the game. They have vested interest. They have some care about the success or failure of an organization. And stakeholders, they can be individuals, groups, or entities. As a stakeholder, they can influence or be influenced by the actions and outcomes related to that organization. So when it comes to a nonprofit, there are a lot of people who have a vested interest and concern for that nonprofit agency. But if you were to take all those people and to categorize them into 4 buckets, you could do that, and they would be staff, volunteers, donors, and the community. Now, what makes running a nonprofit a real challenge is that these 4 stakeholder groups, many times, have different priorities. And sometimes those priorities are in direct contradiction to one another. So it's your job as a nonprofit leader to use things like strategic planning, reliance on partnership, that staff-volunteer partnership, which we'll talk about in a future chapter, to figure out how do we manage all of these conflicting needs and keep these 4 groups of people happy while still running an efficient and successful organization. One of the ways nonprofits can realize success is by being innovative. Innovativeness is an organization's ability to stay ahead of the game, to offer new products and services, and to be on top of advances, and not just technology, but business practices, efficiencies, automations, things like that as well. Now, I'll be the first to admit, unfortunately, the nonprofit sector is known as being a little bit stuck in the past, and a little bit unwilling sometimes to embrace innovation. And there's a good reason for that, because when you're leading a nonprofit organization, you are seen as the guard dog of the donor's money. You're responsible for being a good steward of that money, making sure that money goes to fulfill the mission, making sure that money is spent wisely. You can't be taking huge chances and risks with money that's not yours and potentially losing it. So a lot of nonprofit organizations are afraid to take risks, but it's important for nonprofits to take smart, calculated risks and to be willing to make a change and to be willing to be innovative, because that's the only way that they're going to stay ahead of the game. Because nonprofits are competing with a lot of other different sources of things that are asking people for their money. So if you're not on top of things and you're not innovative, you're going to fail. While being innovative, though, nonprofits always need to make sure that mission is the central focus. But leaders need to ask themselves, how can I keep that mission in the forefront, my mission in mind, to drive that mission forward, but to do it while being innovative and taking calculated risks to explore new ideas and approaches. When it comes to innovation in nonprofits, there's kind of a subsegment of nonprofits where innovation is the key driver, and that is social entrepreneurship. And this is a term that refers to individuals who use all of their entrepreneurship skills to solve problems. And in this case, what makes it social entrepreneurship is they're trying to serve a social need using entrepreneurial skills, values, and practices. Now, social entrepreneurship, it's a little bit outside of the purview of this class. We're not going to talk about it a lot, and it intertwines with nonprofits, but it is kind of its separate thing. But I want you to know what it is. And another term I want you to know is social enterprise. Social enterprise is where you have for-profit businesses that really are making a concerted effort to do good and to serve the greater good and to fulfill and balance profit with social needs. This can be things like positive environmental impact, sustainability, and ethical workforce practices. And nonprofits can be the driver for social enterprise by pushing for-profit organizations to do better and to focus on social enterprise. In addition to being innovative and willing to take chances, there are other things that nonprofits can do to increase the likelihood that they will be successful. If you go out and you study all the nonprofits in the world and you determine the most successful ones, and measuring success in nonprofits can be hard because who's the most well-known, who raises the most money, who has the most impact, how do you measure impact? But if you were to look at the most impactful nonprofits, the most effective nonprofits, 6 traits tend to emerge. One is a willingness to advocate and serve. As we talked about previously in this video, a lot of 501c3 direct service agencies, while they primarily serve to provide direct services, they also advocate as well. And advocacy is important for impact because that can have a broader impact to influence legislation and policy for systemic change. And that could arguably have more impact than even providing direct services in a small local community. So effective nonprofits do both. They provide those direct services, but they also push for systemic change at a broader level. Another is making markets work. And this goes back to that innovativeness aspect. Things like pushing for social enterprise, pushing the for-profit sector to do better when it comes to aligning their practices with the mission of your nonprofit agency and partnering with businesses and industry. Next is to inspire evangelists. It's one thing to have volunteers. All nonprofits pretty much have volunteers, but it's another to convert volunteers to evangelical volunteers. This is where they're out spreading the word, talking positively about your cause, recruiting other volunteers, not just doing the work, but doing it enthusiastically and singing your nonprofit's praises and pushing the mission while they do it. Highly effective nonprofits also nurture their network. They're not afraid to engage in partnerships and collaborations. They're not afraid to work with other nonprofits as collaborators rather than competitors, and to engage in things like coalitions rather than working in isolation. Adaptability is a huge trait of the most effective nonprofits because being innovative, being willing to take risks, being willing to take chances, and to adapt and change with the times, that's key. And finally, shared leadership. As we'll discuss in future chapters, there can sometimes be tensions and conflicts that arise in nonprofits when you've got all of these different power dynamic issues and power struggles, especially between paid staff and unpaid volunteer labor. The most highly effective nonprofits are those that share leadership. They don't see it as just being centralized with one individual or one group of people, but rather they share and distribute that power, that decision-making authority, and that leadership throughout the organization. So keeping these traits in mind can help you be a more effective nonprofit leader. So there you have it, the basics of nonprofit organizations.